Okay, so I'm Holly Branning, and I'm the head of school of, here's a mouthful, Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you all to our first psychology talk of the year. And in particular, I'd like to welcome not only all of the students and staff from Edinburgh University, but also the many, many teachers who are joining us from outside the university. So you're very welcome, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Before I introduce Cathy, I just want to let you know that at the end of the talk, there'll be a reception in 7 George Square, which is just over the other side of the square, and everybody's very welcome to join us for that. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Cathy Rastle to give our talk today. Cathy's one of the leading researchers, particularly in reading. She did her undergraduate degree in the US before moving to Australia to do her PhD. And then came to the UK, to Cambridge, to do postdoctoral work before moving back to Australia, which was a loss for the UK, but then we got her back in the end to Royal Holloway, where she's been since, I think, 2002, and where she's now Professor of Psychology and Head of Department as well. So Cathy's research interests are to do with the representations and processes that underlie human cognition, and in particular language with a focus on reading. So how typical adults read, how the ability to read and use language develops through typical and atypical language development, and how it may become impaired through brain injury. So Cathy's early work on dual root models of reading has been particularly influential. And since then, she's done a lot of work, which is particularly well known, is on how people decompose words when they read, so the way in which they decompose them into their constituent parts, based on meaning or based on spelling. Her work at the moment, one particularly interesting project that she's working on, is the role of sleep in learning, particularly in terms of language learning. And for those of you who are sleep deprived, I'm afraid the news is not good, but you can ask Cathy after the talk for a little bit more detail on that and how you might improve your language learning abilities. So as well as her stellar research, Cathy's also very well known in the field for her service to the academic field. So she's done a lot of work in editing, in chairing research council funding grants. And it's notable, Cathy's work has actually receives funding from a huge range of funding sources, from the biotechnology and I can't even get the whole thing, BBSRC, Economic and Social Research Council, right through to the British Academy and Leverhulme Trust, which I think shows the breadth of her interests. Now, one thing that I think Cathy's research is particularly notable for is the way in which it shows how blue skies or basic scientific research is relevant to and feeds into real-world problems. So basic research on how we read and how it can tell us something about how we can improve reading outcomes in children with dyslexia, for example, implications for pedagogy. And that's what Cathy will be talking about today. But the thing that I thought was interesting reading the title of Cathy's work is, talk today, is that it suggests that not only is she a kind of world-leading researcher and academic service provider, but also she's clearly something of a peacekeeper. And in this case, it's a peacekeeper in academia, in the sense that she's talking about how we can end the reading wars. So I'd like to hand over to Cathy now. Thank you very much, Cathy.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me, and particularly to all of you who've come out on a Friday night. I'm going to talk about reading today, and my talk is a little bit about policy, it's a little bit about practice, and it's a little bit of science thrown in. So I hope it appeals broadly. I want to start by thinking about just how important literacy is. Literacy gives us access to knowledge, employment, social benefits, public services, democracy, and it keeps us safe. And, you know, if we think about modern society, it places very high demands on us in terms of literacy. And for this reason, I often think that teaching children to read is one of the most important functions of the state. And despite the very important role that literacy plays in modern society, It's a pretty well-known finding that around 17% of 15-year-olds in the UK and EU their literacy skills are not sufficient to participate fully in life. And that's based on a load of international comparison studies. And I want to just take a moment to think about what that means. So this is a question from a past paper on one of these large-scale studies. And if we look at this, we can immediately see that this is a warning about peanuts that have inadvertently into some lemon cream biscuits. And the question is just simply, what is the purpose of this notice? Is it to advertise the lemon biscuits? Is it to warn people about the biscuits? Is it where do you buy the biscuits? And you can see that if you are a 15-year-old and you can't answer this question, what kind of chances will you have in life? So these are very, very important issues. And I think, for this reason, low literacy, it presents massive costs to individuals, massive costs to society and to the economy, and it's probably one of the largest contributors to inequality in our society. And I know that that's something that we're all very concerned about. And for a reading scientist, this is all rather perplexing. And it's perplexing because we have over 100 years of research on reading and reading acquisition. And in fact, in the psychological sciences, this is one of the most well-studied phenomena across the board. And scientists always find something to argue about, but in general, there's a very strong consensus on the neural mechanisms, the mental processes that underpin reading, and the way that those insights translate into practice. So given that consensus, how is it that so many children are still being failed by the education system? And I think one of the things is that as a reading researcher, once you start to dig into practice around the world, you find that only rarely have these insights actually been implemented fully in educational practice. And instead, what we've got are around 200 years of what we call reading wars. So the reading wars are a very protracted period of vociferous debate about the way that children should be taught to read. And broadly speaking, this debate has contrasted Phonics Approach. So phonics is where you explicitly tell children about the relationship between letters and sounds, and then from there they can use that spoken language knowledge to access meaning. And that's contrasted to a whole language approach, which emphasizes the discovery of meaning through immersion in a literacy-rich environment. And whole language really had its heyday in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. More recently, these principles are found in programs such as multi-cueing, the Searchlight model, or what we call balanced literacy. And this is very strange because the reading research almost universally supports phonics. So why is it that whole language has had such force? And I think one of the reasons is that the reading debate has become kind of a touchstone, or it's become paradigmatic of a more general debate in education that's contrasting back-to-basics approaches with constructivist, child-centered perspectives. And even more unfortunate or unhelpful is that the reading debate has become embedded in political disputes. So if you look at typically right-wing manifestos, these often include references to phonics or bringing back phonics, whereas whole language is more commonly associated with the left. And here are just some of the kinds of quotes that illustrate how the reading debate is typified in the media. So Michael Rosen is a children's laureate, a very famous author. He has a column in The Guardian. And so you can see here, there's something in this quote that suggests that reading is a natural process, right? If we sit with our children and do texting on phones or read books to our children, they will learn to read. This one down here is from a professor of education, and this is quite typical of often what you hear in education faculties, that reading is really about meaning. Phonics is just barking at print. Right? That's a very common phrase. We want to create readers who create meaning, not trained seals. And this is just a recent text from the former shadow education secretary complaining about the fact that her children had to read non-words. So what are the consequences of all this? Well, the consequences are that despite having a very strong consensus in the field of reading research about how reading is achieved and the rollout of that in terms of instructional approaches, it's really an alphabet soup of policy across the Western world, or the English-speaking world. So in England, I think England is really the only country that has fully implemented scientific evidence, at least at the initial stage of learning to read. England, since the mid-2000s, has made it a legal requirement that primary schools must teach phonics, systematic phonics. And in 2012, the government brought out what's called a phonics screen. So children at the end of year 1 have to do a simple reading test that just assesses their phonic knowledge, or the phonic knowledge is their knowledge of how letters relate to sounds. And since the implementation of this screen in 2012, performance on that has climbed dramatically year on year, and there is evidence emerging that that has also had impacts on broader literacy, such as reading comprehension. Now, Scotland hasn't implemented the evidence. Scotland has multiple methods being used, and sometimes we think that, oh, you know, multiple methods is good, it's the best of everything, but in this case, it usually means not really focusing on what's necessary. And of course, many of you will know that the reading achievement in Scotland is going down. In Australia, they have been using multiple methods for a number of years, but they're now trialing a phonics screen based on the England phonics screen. And in the USA convened a panel, the US Congress convened a panel in the 1990s that scoured all the evidence and produced what is really still one of the definitive works. And from that, they implemented phonics in what's called the Common Core State Standards Initiative, which is the recommendation of how you should teach children to do certain things. But in the US, states don't even have to adopt the Common Core, so they can kind of do whatever they want. And as a result of that and other factors, there is really wide variation across US states in reading achievement. And then in New Zealand, they are still using meaning-based approaches based on whole language. So, of course, these decisions have consequences, right? Big consequences for hundreds of thousands of children each year. And I think it's just an interesting case. If we think about medicine, of course, we know how to treat minor infections with the use of antibiotics, right? So imagine a world in which it was just kind of a bit random about whether you'd get the antibiotics. Sometimes people would die or get, terribly ill because of a minor cut. Of course, we can't imagine that happening, or it being a political issue about whether to use the antibiotics for the cut. So why shouldn't that be the case in education? And I should say as well that typically, even in countries that have implemented scientific evidence to inform their literacy policy, there is usually no literacy policy at all following primary school. So what this creates is a situation in which secondary school teachers haven't really been taught a lot about how children learn to read or what they should be doing to improve pupils' literacy achievement. Okay, so the answer, when we started thinking about this as reading scientists, we thought, well, we should probably try to do something about this. So the thing that we decided to do was to write a paper about it, and it's called Ending the Reading Wars. And basically, what this is an open access paper. That means it's not behind a paywall. You can freely access it. These are my collaborators, Ann Castles and Kate Nation. And what we've done in this paper, we've tried to distill the last 100 years of evidence about reading and reading acquisition. And we've tried to portray this in a very accessible way that portrays the main findings and the most important findings, and that also draws out what are the implications of those findings for classroom practice. So if you're interested in this area, please download this paper. And actually, if you download that, you could just leave, because it says most of what I want to say. And you can read it by your fire or something. Okay, so what is reading? And I think it's illustrated by just this sentence. This is a very simple sentence. Jess decided to cut and run. She couldn't face what might happen next. What does it take to read that? Well, it takes many things. Reading is multifaceted. So we have analysis of visual features. Our writing, we can see here, well, if that just had a longer squiggle there, that might be rub, right? So we have to analyze fine-grained visual features. We've got to analyze the identity of letters and the position of those letters so we don't transpose letters. This word here, well, that's got an ED. Well, that means something very specific. It means the past, and we know about that. Right? We have to analyze the meanings of individual words. We've got figurative language here, right? So she decided to cut and run. What does that mean? She couldn't face what happens next. Well, that's not a human face or an animal face. That's some other kind of face. We have causal connections in there. Background knowledge. Well, why? What's happening with Jess? And, of course, all of this computation, it places great demands on working memory and executive skill. And I think that the complexity of reading has really spurred the debate in the reading wars, right? Because people have said, well, skilled readers, they analyze the meaning of this so quickly. Right? So when we go to teach someone to read, that's what we should be doing. We should teach kids all of these skills. And that's actually the mistake that the whole language people made really back in the 60s and 70s. They said, well, it's not all about phonics. And it absolutely is not all about phonics. But it's a mistake to think that all those aspects of reading should be taught at the same time. And I like to give an example, an analogy to chess. So if we think about teaching someone to play chess, if we look at skilled chess players, experts, what you find is that they don't actually see individual pieces. They see the game holistically. They build strategies, seeing the whole game, planning moves way in advance. So they don't see these pieces as distinct. So if we thought, I'm going to sit down and teach someone how to play chess, would that insight inform how we teach them? No. We would teach them by showing them what the pieces are and how they can move, what their worth is. That's how we would start. And in the same way, we can say, well, skilled readers, they draw meaning rapidly. It's effortless. They draw causal connections. They use inferencing. How should that inform how we teach people at the very first stages to learn to read? I would argue that it doesn't really inform them. We have to start with the very basics of mapping these visual symbols onto sounds and their meanings. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to try to focus in on how we compute the meanings of single words. And single words are the basis of reading, right? If we can't understand single words, we cannot understand text. Of course, there's more that's overlaid onto that, but we don't have 8 hours this evening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to introduce to you a dual pathway model. And the idea is that children come to the task of reading. And remember, reading is a cultural invention, right? So this is a skill that we teach to children. They come to the classroom with some semblance of oral language. Right? They know vocabulary, they know how to speak, they can understand. And the task of reading then is to map spellings onto meanings. And what I'll try to persuade you of is that there's 2 ways to do this. One way is via mapping spellings to sounds, and that's via phonics. And the other way is by mapping spellings onto meanings. And what I'm going to argue is that there's a developmental time course that governs how we use these pathways, both in the mind and in the brain. And what I'll argue is we start this way, and in the brain, characterized by this neural pathway, and then to build fluency, we develop this pathway, represented by the red arrow. So, where are we? Okay, when we think about how we read single words, we need to start with the writing system. So writing systems are all an expression of spoken language, but they vary considerably. And that's actually what it is that's being learned. Right? So if we think about how does the brain solve the problem of reading, well, it depends on what the writing system is. Right? So let's look at a couple. Here's Korean. This is known as the most scientifically advanced writing system ever created. It's very recent, about 600 years old. And Korean provides a one-to-one mapping between visual symbols and sounds. And what's more, the shape of the letters are shaped in the form of the articulatory organs that would be needed to produce those sounds. Right? And that was very deliberate when Korean was created. So Korean provides a direct line into spoken language. Right? If you see the symbols, you know the sound, and you know how to produce the sound. Chinese is very different. Right? Chinese, you've got to learn individual characters. And there is some componentry to Chinese. There's semantic information, there's phonetic information, but it is a very different challenge. You've got to learn characters one by one. Here's Braille. So we see Braille is a writing system. Right? So we see it represents letters. It also represents common words. And it also represents some morphemes or even digraphs. So Braille is a different challenge altogether. And even in the many systems that use the Roman alphabet, there's great variation in how the symbols represent sounds, right? So in English, symbols typically represent sounds, although, as we know, there is some exceptionality in English that causes people trouble when they learn to read. So the initial problem of learning to read is really learning how to crack the code of your writing system, right? And in English, phonics is simply a way of telling children in advance how to crack the code. It's saying, this is what these symbols represent, this is how they represent it, so I want you to learn it in this way. Right? So I think from a reading scientist perspective, right, there's nothing that's surprising about this. You know, how we read is simply determined by what it is that the brain is trying to solve. So let's think about English again. So estimates suggest that most skilled readers by the age of 20 can recognize about 70,000 different words. Text studies of the types of books that children are exposed to in the first year of schooling, reception, suggest that they're exposed to about 5,000 words in that year. So let's think about the child coming to the task of learning to read. So they come with some knowledge of oral language, and now they have to map spelling somehow onto meaning. If we think about these words, we can see, well, there's two possible ways that they could do that. But the learning challenge is not equivalent in both of those pathways. So in this pathway is highly systematic. If we learn cut and cat, that will help us to learn can, right? So here we have words that look similar, and they also sound similar. So there's the capacity for generalization to new words on that pathway. If we just tried to learn the meanings of these, well, that's very arbitrary, because here we have all these words, they look very similar, but they don't mean similar things. Right? So you just have to learn them one at a time. Right? Humans are very bad at that kind of learning, right? That arbitrary learning. And so that's why reading scientists, in addition to the evidence, it makes sense to say, well, let's go this way. And once you translate that to sound, then you can capitalize on this spoken language knowledge to get to the meanings of those words. Okay. So people sometimes say to me, when I talk about this, well, what about Chinese? Because people can, Chinese learners can learn Chinese characters, and that's broadly speaking quite arbitrary. Well, there's a few answers to that. And one of the answers is that learning Chinese characters is a very slow process. And it's estimated that if you learn 4,000 of them, that's enough for full literacy. So the learning challenge in Chinese is completely different to the learning challenge in an alphabetic language like English. Right? It's an order of magnitude different. The other interesting thing about Chinese is that in the 1950s, they actually made up a new alphabet called Pinyin. And this is an alphabetic way of writing Chinese in terms of letters that map onto sounds. And the reason that they did this was to improve children's literacy. It gave children a way to start to learn how to read while they were still doing this painstaking task of memorizing individual characters. Right? So I think people are very, very bad at doing this. It just wouldn't be feasible for the 70,000 words or even the 5,000 that children need to learn in the first year of reception. So there's a huge amount of evidence that suggests that learning to read requires children to learn this pathway, the mapping between spelling and sound, and there's a huge amount of evidence that teaching children explicitly what this mapping is, telling them the code, is the best way for them to acquire that. Now I want to show you some research that we've done recently in my lab that uses skilled adult readers to try to demonstrate this principle. So what we do is we bring adults into the lab, and these are Royal Holloway students, so they're high-achieving students, and we teach them over a period of weeks or many weeks how to read new words printed in artificial alphabets. So what we do first is we give them a spoken language vocabulary, just like children get, and then over each day we bring them in and we teach them how to read what these sound like, what they mean. And when an adult is fully trained on one of these new artificial alphabets, if we put them in an fMRI scanner and look at how the brain reacts to these new stimuli, what we find is that the neural systems involved in reading these artificial words are very similar to the neural systems involved when they read in English. So we know that this is a method that we can use to start to understand the process of learning to read. All right. So in the study that I'm going to show you, what we did is we brought the adults into the lab, we gave them a spoken language vocabulary, and then over the next 9 days, for 2 hours a day, we trained them up on the scripts and the relationship to sounds and meanings. Now, the adults learned 2 languages in this study, 24 words per language, and we varied the nature of the training in the 2 languages. So in one language, we gave them phonics. We just really drilled spelling to sound, spelling to sound. In the other language, we really drilled meaning. So we use a whole range of meaning tasks. And we looked at their learning. So this is how they did when we tested them on reading aloud. And this is the day of training. So you see they get up to day 10. So by day 10, they've had about 20 hours of training on these words. And this is just their accuracy. And so what you can see is that when we make it hard for them to learn the relationship between spelling and sound, because we focused on meaning, they have a really hard time with the reading aloud task, right? The meaning training just doesn't help them. And when we put them in the fMRI scanner at the end of training, what we find is the same, what we call these dorsal pathway regions, light up for the meaning-based language. And our interpretation of that, these are effort effects. So that pathway that's trying to get the spelling sound mapping is having to work overtime because they've been taught the meaning. We've really drilled them on the meaning of this particular language. Right? So they're having trouble with that. Now, people might say, well, but reading isn't about reading aloud, it's about comprehension. So maybe when they got the meaning, they're much better at comprehension. So we also measure their comprehension of these words. And what you can see is that, in fact, there's no difference. If we just drill them on phonics for the 10 days, they're just as good at comprehension as if we drilled them on meaning. And the reason for that is phonics enables them to hook into their spoken language knowledge that we've given them at the very start. And when we look at the fMRI scans at the end of training, what we get are no effort effects at all. So it doesn't matter whether they've been absolutely drilled on meaning or drilled on phonics. They're equally good at comprehension, and that's the same effect in the brain. Now, we might say, well, actually, this means that you can just use meaning-based approaches, right? But remember here, we've restricted this to 48 words, right? And it's taken them 20 hours to learn the 48 words. Imagine, and these are adults, high-achieving students. Imagine a reception child, 4 years old in reception, having to learn 5,000 holistically, one by one. That system would just break down. So those findings were no surprise to us. And in fact, when we published them, some of the reviewers just said, I don't even know if this should be published. It's just so obvious, right? It's obvious because people are better at doing systematic learning than they are doing arbitrary learning, right? And phonics provides a way to do systematic learning, right? But these data are consistent with a huge raft of evidence about the importance of spelling-sound relationship when children come to the task of learning to read, and the effectiveness of phonics, or telling them explicitly how to solve that mapping. Now, some people say, well, isn't it possible that some children can learn to read, whatever they're given? And I encounter people all the time that say, well, I didn't get phonics. And indeed, I didn't get phonics either. So it certainly is possible that some children can discover this spelling sound mapping without being told what it is explicitly. But the evidence that that's something that can happen for a wide variety of children is pretty limited. And I think that there's 3 sources of evidence that this is not a good way to bank on children learning to read. One is studies with children. So Brian Byrne at the University of New England in Australia did a series of studies with children looking at whether when they were trained on certain words, and then they were asked to generalize their spelling sound knowledge to new words. And broadly speaking, the children just could not do it. They couldn't do it if they hadn't had any explicit instruction on the nature of the spelling sound mapping. Now, we've replicated these studies with adults. So in our artificial learning experiments, we also sometimes vary the training. So we'll give one group just the 48 words to learn. And then we train them up. They learn the words over 10 days. And then we see, can they generalize to non-words written in that same script? And what we find is that only 25% of our adults can actually generalize. So only 25% of our high-achieving students, after 20 hours of training, could get that mapping. They could discover it on their own. Right? And we contrast that with a group where we just give a 10-minute PowerPoint presentation at the start about how the writing system works, and then they're perfect through the whole of training. Right? It just makes their learning much easier. And finally, there's been a recent paper just published in Experimental Economics. And this has actually evaluated the rollout of phonics in England. And it's looking for longer-term effects on broader literacy comprehension. And what this shows is that the rollout of phonics in the mid-2000s, it actually had a positive impact on children's broader literacy, reading comprehension, 2 years later when they were 7 years old. That applied to all children. But it was still having an impact on 11-year-old children who were at risk of reading failure when they entered school. Right? So it's possible that some of us, it doesn't matter how we're taught. We're going to just pick it up. We're going to learn to read. But what we know is that systematic phonics doesn't hurt anyone. Right? It's good for all of us. It seems to be vital for some people. And that's why some people have called phonics the great equalizer. Right? Because we know that when children enter reception, there is huge variation in their language ability and their language experience. And if you give somebody the tools to start to read independently, what that allows them to do is build their vocabulary on their own. Right? And I think, if there is one intervention that's cheap, straightforward, and that has the potential to transform the lives of thousands of children, it would be to put systematic phonics in every single classroom. Of course, phonics isn't the end of reading, but it is the beginning. Right? Okay, I want to just take a moment to think about shared storybook reading, because this is a theme that I think has been invoked, particularly in whole language circles, that's perpetuated the reading wars. And the idea is that somehow, by reading books with our children, that's a good way for them to learn to read. And this is a nice study from a few years back, looking at what's happening when 4- and 5-year-old children are doing shared storybook reading with their parents. And they put an eye tracker on these children. And what you can see, the circles are where the children are looking when they're doing the shared storybook reading. And you can see that they're not looking at the text at all, right? They're looking at the pictures. So shared storybook reading is so good for so many reasons. But it is unlikely that this would ever be a major vehicle for learning to read, at least in the first stages of learning to read, when children are just first developing those print skills. Okay, I want to turn just for a moment now to skilled reading. Right? So we know that skilled readers also use their phonic knowledge. We know when we read that we're activating sound-based codes, and that is the reason why you can read this sign, right? Because you've translated it to sound. But we know from research that that process is actually slow, it's attention demanding. And we also know in English is imperfect, right? And it's unlikely that that kind of knowledge could ever form the basis of the rapid type of reading that we're all used to doing. And I want to tell you about a study that I did recently with Betty Musiku, who was working in my lab. And what we did, so in year 1 in England, the children have to read 20 non-words. That's the phonics screen. By the time they get to university, they come into my lab, and they have to read 915 of these. Right, so we had 40 people read 915 non-words. And the reason that we do that is we want to probe the nature of their phonic knowledge. What do they know about spelling-sound relationships? And remember, these are sort of 20-year-old students, high achieving, so they've had many, many years of reading experience. And what we found was that there was a lot of variation in how people read these non-words, okay? And in fact, we got some of the non-words, there was only one pronunciation given across all the participants. So for example, bamper, there was only one pronunciation. This one here, iluch or iluk, generated 22 different pronunciations, right? And this is just a graph. This graph took like whole weekends to make, so I show it whenever I can. So this is just kind of showing the variation. So this is items that got 22 pronunciations, and you can see they're sort of pretty much equal. And what we found is that we could predict the variation across participants simply by looking at the nature of the units that were in each of these non-words and how they are used in English. Right? So for things like that one there, the L is pretty consistent in the words of English, but the rest of it isn't. Right? So that we could predict why that showed a lot of variability. But I think what's really interesting about this is that it shows, even for skilled readers, who we know that they use phonic knowledge, and we know that phonics is a non-negotiable part of reading, there's considerable uncertainty in this mapping, right? People just don't really know. They're imprecise, even after years and years of experience with text. And that's one of the reasons that I think that phonic knowledge cannot be the be-all and end-all, even with regard to single-word reading. There's got to be something else. And indeed, if we look at all theories of skilled reading, I was just going to give you an interim summary first. So before we get on to that next bit, I'm just going to summarize that spelling sound, it acknowledges the primary regularity in an alphabetic system, right? We know it's critical in reading acquisition. Phonics is the best way to impart that. We know the brain pathway that underpins that kind of knowledge. That knowledge mirrors regularities in the writing system, but that even after years of experience in English, people are quite uncertain of the nature of that relationship. Right? So is it sufficient? And actually, models of skilled reading suggest that it is insufficient. And all models of skilled reading suggest that in order to become a skilled, confident reader, we somehow need to connect spelling directly to meaning. And this is a really hard task because we've got 70,000 of these words to learn. And one of the most influential hypotheses is one developed by David Scher. And what David Scher suggests is that when children learn this mapping between spelling and sound, that enables them to get to meanings in a pretty good way for a long time. And kids can do that. They can then learn to read independently and start to get the text experience that's required to begin to learn this pathway. Right? So the learning of this pathway takes a long, long time, right? And it requires a lot of text experience. What we know about that pathway is that it really encodes long-term experience. It's about expertise with writing. And we know that it's based just on massive text experience over many years. So if we look at, there's a nice study looking at how much text do children actually get. So this is grade 5 children. About the 50th percentile, they're getting about 1 million words per year, 900,000 words per year. But you can see just huge variation. So the bottom 10% are getting about 60,000 words a year exposure, whereas the top 10% are getting more like 6 million words a year. Right? And actually, this is another reason. If you don't have the foundational skills to begin to read and read easily, you are never going to have that kind of text experience. Right? So the foundation is important, but of course, phonics isn't enough. If you have perfect decoding, but you don't get the text experience, you will never become a skilled reader. Right? So these are complementary. And we also know, and this is very new research, looking at this brain pathway that underpins this mapping seems to be changing in sensitivity all the way into late adolescence. Right? So the neural systems that are responsible for the laying down of expertise, reading doesn't stop at the age of 8. It keeps going into secondary school. And these are producing qualitative changes in reading behavior. And I'm going to talk about some of that in just a minute. So what is it that people are experiencing through all of this text experience? And how do they solve that challenge of learning to read or recognize 70,000 words? Now, people have talked about orthographic learning on an item-by-item basis, kind of like we'd learn Chinese characters, one word and then another word. Now, I've been interested in something else, and that is, what is the impact of something called morphology on the learning of that mapping? So morphology, this is units of meaning. And I'm sorry about this font. That just appeared that way. If we think about morphology, these are things like ed and s and ing. If we think about that, that just dramatically reduces the scale of the challenge that children have to deal with. So we think the average 20-year-old can recognize about 71,000 words. If we get rid of all the past tenses and plurals, that takes it down to 42,000. If we get rid of all the derivations, so like all these prefixed words, if we count all of these as the same, and these are basically all the same word, that takes it down to 11,000 that you have to learn. Right? So if you know something about morphology, then that makes this challenge much, much easier. Now I've talked about arbitrariness in that pathway. So cat, cut, and can, they look similar, but they don't mean similar things. Well, those are just words with a single morpheme. Once we start to have these more complex words that you get later in reading experience, what we see is that the situation changes. And about 85% of English words are built of these kinds of constituents. And so here we have a case where words that look similar now mean similar things, right? So unclean, cleanly, cleaner, they all have something to do with clean, right? And similarly, if we have words like teacher, builder, and cleaner, well, this is all something, the ER is telling us something about agency. They're all agents. Right? So if we can discover that, then maybe that will help us develop this mapping that's so essential for building fluency and expertise. And recently, we've been doing some work on the nature of English writing and discovered something which I think is quite interesting. So it's been known for a long time that English sacrifices spelling sound regularity in order to preserve meaning in the spelling. And this is actually, English has changed over the last 1,250 years to make this kind of information more visible. So if we had these three words, busted, snored, and kicked, if I wanted to spell those like they sounded, I would spell them differently, right? I'd spell kicked with a T at the end. And snored, I'd get rid of that E, right? But I spell them this way because it immediately denotes to me that those are all about the past. And that information is not in the spoken signal. Those all end with different sounds. Right? That's about the past, and that's only in the writing. So I've sacrificed spelling sound regularity in order to have these units of meaning. And it turns out, in English, that particular letter clusters have become reserved for communicating items of meaning, or aspects of meaning. So I'm just going to show you some graphs, and let me take you through these. So this is the sound sequence ickle at the end of a word, ickle. And if you have ever taught somebody to spell, you know that English spelling is almost impossible to learn. You can spell ickle in many, many ways, right? Y-C-L-E, like cycle, icicle, pickle, nickel, and comical, right? But if we then look at the grammatical class of all of these words, what you see is that there is only one way to spell ickle if it's an adjective, right? And that's I-C-A-L, right? It's almost perfect. And this is the sound sequence lus at the end of a word, right? So again, how do you spell it? It could just be anything, L-I-S-S, L-I-S, L-I-S-E, L-A-C-E. But what we see, if it's an adjective, there's only one way to spell it. It's L-E-S-S. If it's not an adjective, it has to be spelled another way. And it turns out that this type of regularity is really ubiquitous in English spelling. Right? And many people don't know this. So when I talk to teachers about that, they say, can you write this down so we can know how to teach these rules? And so we have a paper coming out about this. But what we can see, in a sense, I mean, English spelling is it's just so difficult to teach somebody to spell. But actually, the proliferation of different spellings has allowed some spellings to become reserved to communicate certain meanings. So all of a sudden, if we see L-E-S-S at the end of the word, we immediately know it's an adjective. It almost has to be an adjective, right? And that's, if we've looked at all 154 English suffixes, and that's characteristic of all of them, right? So you can read that paper too. All right, so English spelling has very high visibility of this type of meaningful information, right? That information is not available in the sound. So if English were just a translation of the sound, if we had if each letter mapped onto a sound, we would lose this meaningful information. So it's very important. And if we know about this information, all of a sudden we can see that these words are basically all the same word. We can just learn one, and then we can learn the affixes. And then we can decode, we can know the meanings of all 15 of those instead of learning all 15. And I've been very interested in how skilled readers make use of that information, right, and how it's learned. And I started looking at this about 20 years ago, and we were just interested in, do people do anything with this kind of information? So we did what's called a priming experiment. And this is where you present a word like teacher, and then you present something like teach, or you could present forest and then tree, and then you see how much the first word helps you recognize the next word. And you compare it to something that's where the first word is completely unrelated. Right? So what we have here are priming effects. So that's how much it helps you, that's how much faster you are to recognize teach if you've seen teacher rather than something just completely unrelated. Right? And so we can see that, seeing teacher, that primes teach much more than forest primes tree. So it's special. Right? But of course, teacher and teach look the same too. So maybe it's just that, your letters have been primed. So what we did in this case is we made a control condition, corner, corn. So corner has nothing to do with corn, right? And we found at this stage that these items were very, very hard to find, right? There's only about 60 of them in the language. And of course, now we know why, and it's because these kinds of items don't really occur. Usually, something like corner would be spelled a different way because this is reserved. This is reserved to communicate something else, right? But we didn't know that 20 years ago. And what we found was that when we did this kind of experiment, we got the same kind of priming effect for corner priming corn, but only when primes were unconscious. They were presented so fast that participants couldn't see them. Right? And we thought, what's going on here? Maybe it's just about having a word embedded. And so we spent the next 10 years trying to figure this out. And what we found was that it's not about word embeddings. What these skilled readers were doing is they're taking words apart at the very first stages of word recognition on the basis of these components, right? These morphemic components. And they were doing it for words like corner as well. Right? And of course, the reason they're doing that is that this provides a really fast way to get to the likely meaning of a word, right? If you can break a word apart like this, then you can immediately get to that content-rich part of the word. Right? This is a casualty of that process, right? But there's not very many of these. Right? So it's possible that we can do this in English. Now, we've got lots and lots of studies showing the same thing, and it suggests that skilled readers have discovered something about morphology, right? And we thought this was really kind of neat because most of our participants wouldn't have the first faintest clue of what a morpheme is, right? And they certainly had never been taught this, right? In England, they're now beginning to teach this information explicitly. I'm just going to sort of briefly go over this. This is just an ERP study. And so what we do is we put electrodes on the scalp, and we plot out the brain waves when people are reading certain things. And in this one, all they did was they were reading words like shovel, teacher, and corner. They were reading them silently to themselves. And what we were able to do with this technique was map out the time course of this segmentation process. So what we found with skilled readers is within about 200 milliseconds, they're already breaking it into these parts, these meaningful chunks. And then about 60 milliseconds later, we had evidence that, okay, now the meaning bits are coming in. Right? So that first segmentation is allowing rapid activation of meaning. So this analysis is very rapid. First 200 milliseconds, people are already breaking the words down into their meaningful chunks. Right? It's rapid because it's superficial. Right? You don't actually have to know the meanings of these words to do the analysis. And we know it's superficial because they also do it with corner. Right? Now, it's only possible to have that kind of superficial analysis because of our writing system. And that is because the writing system doesn't really allow words like corner. Right? Usually, when these meaningful chunks are in words, they do mean something. Right? And so people have taken advantage of this. Now, I've told you that that kind of information, learning about the morphology of the language, might be really instrumental in getting to grips with this pathway. It massively reduces the learning challenge, and we've seen that skilled readers use this kind of information. But I haven't provided you any evidence that morphology is really tied to this pathway. So that's what I'm just going to do now quickly. And what we did was what's called a diffusion tensor imaging study. This is a type of brain imaging where we look at white matter pathways. Right? And I have to acknowledge Maya Yablonsky and Mikhail Ben-Shahar in Israel, because they're the experts at this. So what they did is they took 45 of our Royal Holloway participants, and we scanned them, and then they traced the dorsal pathway and the ventral pathway fiber tracts in each of these subjects. So remember, the dorsal pathway is the spelling to sound pathway. It's also involved in a lot of oral language. And the ventral pathway is all about spellings to meanings, right? So we're really interested in these red and orange pathways. Right? Those are the ventral pathways connecting spelling to meaning. And what we did was we gave all of these readers a behavioral measure of the extent to which they knew something about morphology, right? Were they breaking words down to their morphemes while they were doing skilled reading tasks? And what we found was that the extent to which our skilled readers were using morphological information, that was correlated with white matter properties in these ventral tracts, but not in the dorsal ones. Right? So it's not something that just correlated with everything. It's specific to this spelling to meaning pathway. And what's more, it's not just that, that spelling to meanings pathway is better if they're better at everything. Those correlations still held when we partialed out their ability to do phonological tasks, like non-word reading or non-word repetition. So there is a degree of specificity to this. And this is just in case people are interested in that type of imaging. You can see those are the correlations with all the ventral tracts. So what we see is that in skilled readers, we do have variation in people's knowledge of this type of information. And I think that's not surprising, because they've probably never been taught it. So this is just whether they've been able to discover that information in their text experience. And what we see is that that is associated with properties, or white matter properties in the ventral stream, connecting spellings to meanings. And that's consistent with work related to other types of imaging. Now, what do we know about developing readers? Well, we know that when children come to school, they know a lot about morphology. So if you give them an oral task where you say, teach, he was a very good, they'll be able to say teacher, typically. Right? We know if we test children the first few years of reading instruction, about the ages of 8 or 9, they are using this type of knowledge in some of their reading tasks. But what we find, if we do the types of priming experiments, particularly with unconscious presentation like we do with adults, what we find is children in primary school just don't show these phenomena. Right? We've just completed a study with much older children, and we find that those phenomena only start to appear when children are about 14 to 15 or 16 to 18. Right? So again, this is suggesting that that expertise is just continuing to build as children are in secondary school. Right? The reading system is changing qualitatively. They're not just getting better, they're getting different. Right? And that's consistent with what we know about the development of that underlying brain system, which continues to change in sensitivity into adolescence. Right. So I'm going to conclude. The first conclusion, I think, I just want to say that reading is multifaceted. It's a really tough problem. There's many, many elements that you've got to get right if you want to be a good reader. Right? And all reading scientists say that. The next point I want to say is that phonics just falls out of an alphabetic writing system. There's nothing sort of magical about phonics. It's just how our writing system works. And the practice of systematic phonics is simply telling children explicitly how the writing system works, not leaving it for them to discover by chance. Right? And I just want to repeat that phonics, if we're looking for an intervention, phonics is so cheap, it's straightforward, and it's remarkably effective. Right? So I really believe that it should be in all primary school classrooms. We know that phonics provides the foundation. It's non-negotiable, but we know that we have to build fluency. We have to build fluency through text experience. If people don't have the foundations, they will never get the text experience that they require. Conversely, even if people do have the foundations, if they don't get the text experience, they will never be a good reader. And what I've tried to suggest is that learning to appreciate the morphology in English writing may be a critical part of building that experience and getting to grips with the many tens of thousands of words that English readers need to learn to be able to recognize. Another conclusion is that we often think that reading ends when children are about 8 or 9. It takes at least 10 years to learn to read. Reading, it's a vastly complex skill. And so we mostly talk about primary school curricula. What should a secondary school curriculum look like? Right? What do we do about those children who get to secondary school and can't access the curriculum? But even those that can, what should we be doing to make sure that they turn into skilled, confident readers? And I think a very important point is that all of this depends on spoken language. We know that there is vast differences when children enter school in their language ability, and particularly if children have real difficulties with spoken language, it's going to be really difficult to get them learning to read. But my main conclusion is the conclusion that we made in our paper, and that is that it's time to end the reading wars. The science is very clear. There's strong consensus. And it's time to adopt an agenda that's based on, informed developmentally, and that's based on our deep understanding of how language and writing systems work. Thank you very much. Do you want this? Yeah, sure.
So I think we have some time for questions. I'm just going to let anybody who needs to leave now. Okay, and now we have time for questions, and I'll let Kathy.
Okay. Okay. Can everyone still hear me? I've just noticed that there's a baby over here that's been remarkably quiet. I mean, that's just amazing. Who wants to go first? Okay, we have a question.
Thank you very much. Fantastic topic. It was particularly nice to see morphology coming up.
It's my favorite topic.
Yeah, one of mine too. And I mean, you gave an example first from reflectional morphology, but then you spoke mainly about derivation. So is there a difference between derivation and reflectional systems? And the second question is, and you mentioned already some language comparisons. Now, some languages prefer to be more faithful to the sound, and some prefer to be more faithful to the morphology. In fact, the British Isles have a wonderful double dissociation between Welsh and Scottish Italian. So, vowel in Welsh will be M and F, so clearly some correspondence. In Gaelic, we will be putting an H, so morphing. Is there anywhere looking whether these two systems induce people to have a different strategy?
I just think it's such an interesting question, and I think I actually can't answer the question because I think there's not enough research. But one thing that when I started doing work on morphology, people always used to say, "Well, English is such a terrible language to look at morphology because English doesn't have a very rich morphology, right? We don't have lots of different cases." But it turns out, if you look at the spelling, that morphology is highly visible, right? It's much more visible in spelling than it is in the spoken language, and I think it's interesting. And I think that in some sense, compensates for the irregularity in sound. And, it could have been, English is such a fascinating language because English doesn't have a national academy that regulates its spelling. So English is it's self-organizing, it's anarchic. English has been changing for the last 1,250 years. And if you go back, English could have become spelling sound consistent. But it didn't, right? It became more spelling meaning consistent so that these morphological regularities became more prevalent. Right, so I think, one thing I would love to be able to do is to start to look at these other languages to say, well, how much does the spelling convey, morphology versus sound? And the kinds of comparisons that you mentioned are just fascinating. But I have nothing, intelligent to say about them. But I would love to talk more about how these languages work. So thank you. Other questions? Yes.
You finished by saying it all depends on spoken language, and it does, obviously, you're not going to be able to read without it. given that, do you think that the age of 4 or 5 is the ideal age to introduce specific teaching of the print stuff? Or might it be better to leave it for another couple of years, particularly for those children who have come to school with multiple language?
Well, the question, in case anybody didn't hear, is, is 4 or 5 too early to start language instruction, particularly for children, reading instruction, particularly for children who might be coming with poor language? I think it's an interesting question. I think there's been some new research recently suggesting that maybe up to 2 children in every classroom might have poor language. This is a real problem for those children learning to read. I think, broadly speaking, particularly looking at the experience in England, where, phonics teaching, since the phonics screen came in, phonics teaching has gotten better and better and better and better every single year as teachers become more knowledgeable, more highly skilled with regard to this particular method of instruction. So I think that, 4 or 5 isn't too early to be doing that in most cases. But I do think that where children are coming with poor language, there's an urgent need to address that so that they don't fall further behind with their reading instruction. And unfortunately, I don't know the situation in Scotland, but in England schools, it's very difficult now to get speech and language therapy in for those children, unless they have very, very serious needs. And I've seen that as a school governor as well. So I think it's not too early. I think there is decent evidence that getting off the ground early with phonics so that you can start to read independently and get the text experience is beneficial. But, language is very important, and we have to make sure that all children are starting at a point where they can access print.
Given Soviet research in New Zealand, it may go a little different in the long run, whether you started at 5 or 7. Do you think there's been enough research to back up one way or the other?
Probably not. And certainly, the long-term impacts in that research of phonics are hard to find, and it's a mixed picture whether there's very long-term impacts. I mean, we'd expect for this type of instruction to wash away, over time. And I think that the experimental economic study that I pointed to is quite interesting because it does suggest for a proportion of children, the phonics instruction is still having an effect at age 11. So it's still helping those children with poor language or EAL, English as an additional language, to read. But you can talk later. I can see you're skeptical. Yeah.
So, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
As a somewhat hapless learner of Chinese myself, I was really interested in your work with artificial languages and thinking about, especially when you mentioned Chinese, since they've introduced the Pinyin language that represents letters to the characters, does that actually help, and does phonics have a role when the children still have to remember that there's a direct link between the Pinyin word and the characters? That's not immediately evident.
Oh, let's see. So I think that there is research suggesting that having the Pinyin helps learn the characters. I seem to remember citing that in the Reading Wars paper. And I think, it does make perfect sense because it just takes a long, long time to remember these characters. So Pinyin helps you to just have the time and get the text experience needed to do that learning. I mean, Chinese characters are interesting because there is you can break these down into semantic and phonological components, although last I looked, you needed to learn about 850 different characters to be able to really capitalize on those regularities. So good luck with your Chinese. The questions? Yes.
So there's a tension in your talk between the first part and the second part, right? Where the first part is phonics is all important, the second part is, well, actually morphology and the history of the language is hugely important as well. So to what degree should phonics curricula actually be influenced by the study of morphology? Are we doing phonics the right way?
Yeah, so that's a good question about whether we should be focusing on morphology at the early stage or phonology. And we've just written a paper on this where we've looked at, if you take children's texts in reception, you can say, well, what words are broadly represented in the books that they learn? About 80% of what they're exposed to are monomorphemic, words with a single morpheme. So in these sorts of words, learning about morphology just plays no role at all, right? For the 20% that aren't, they're usually the inflections, so things like a plural or a past tense. So I think it is good. In the England national curriculum, they do teach plurals and past tense early. I think that will help children learn to to decode that part of the writing. I think most of the derivational morphology does come later in the text experience. And I just don't, what we know is that for instruction to be effective, it has to be backed up by experience. Right? So there's really no point, I think, in diluting the time that you have for phonics to teach things about, IST and LESS until you're going to get those words. And I think, if we had unlimited time to teach reading, maybe we could do that. But typically, there's very little time in the day. There's limited instructional time. And I think, as teachers, teachers need to say, well, what is going to be the most effective at this time? And I think based on what we know about the writing system and all of the evidence about phonics, I think it is to get a secure foundation of spelling sound knowledge. But I think that it would be a good thing later to teach morphology explicitly. Because, like phonics, so a lot of children won't discover the phonics on their own. And surely a lot of people won't discover the morphology on their own. Right? A lot of people don't. Okay, another question? Oh, yes?
It's more of a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I read this paper, the word reading is appropriate to someone who can't read and looks for obvious in a paper that they had another book by John Patrick, which I subjected to the same treatment, and really queries the definition of how you measure reading and what is reading about. But in both cases, I found myself becoming unaccountably increasingly angry. I thought, well, yeah, this is interesting, but you were saying all children must do this kind of when they're 4 years old. This terrifies me. I mean, it provides a legitimation for teachers to compel everybody to follow common activities, and that drives out, especially in the early years, all the way through, drives out the possibility of education focusing on other things, the development of other talents and abilities, focusing on this one thing, this reading in the sense of read this silly paragraph and answer 9 silly questions. It focuses attention on that kind of thing rather than all the other things that could be going on in education. And this is quite appalling when you look at Alison Wolf's evaluations of vocational education among 16 and 18. But because, as you said, we still got 20% at that level, we still can't read. Focusing then, even at that age, on doing that, rather than, and of course this compulsion element, focusing on doing that, rather than nurturing other talents and abilities, which you would expect to find in vocational education. This theme, this belief, which is such overriding force, drives out very many important things.
Well, I'm just going to disagree with you because I think, it's great to have other talents, but I think it's really important to teach kids how to read, right? Because it's going to, not...
That's where we disagree.
Okay. Well, we can disagree on that, but I think we're not going to be able to meet halfway on that. I think reading is a critical life skill.
Germany had 25% of its workforce which didn't even speak German, never mind reading, and they were able to function perfectly well in that kind of society. And that is why I'm looking at adults in the workplace. Very many. Drawing the adult, how else could you work, run a society?
Okay. That is an experiment I don't want to have. Thank you for your comment. Is there another question? Yes. Was there? Okay. Yes. Thank you. That's a really interesting question, and I think there has been a tiny amount of research about whether, if people have difficulties with learning spelling sound mappings or difficulties in spoken language, can you use morphology as a compensatory strategy to get a sort of a basic reading going? I am not sufficiently familiar with that research to give a good answer to that. I think probably, based on what I know, the jury is out. There's not enough research to make a strong conclusion. But I think, for kind of the vast majority of the population, I think phonics is the key thing to try to get going. And we know that, you know, the key intervention for dyslexia is good phonics, right? So it's a win-win because it's good for kids who aren't dyslexic and good for kids who are. Yep. Was there anybody else that had? Oh, there's one in the back. I am going to come to you, but you've already asked one. Another one at the back. Well, I sort of am puzzled by that myself, but we know that the reading wars began about 200 years ago in the U.S. House of Representatives, and it was the American Whig Party who was very upset about tyranny. They were very worried about tyranny. And there was a man called Horace Mann, who was a Secretary of Education in the Massachusetts government, and he in particular was very worried about the tyranny of making children learn letter-to-sound relationships. So I think this is kind of where it started, because prior to that, Horace Mann was around 1800. Prior to that, going back all the way to the 1600s, phonics was the key way of teaching children to read. And one of the key proponents of that was Noah Webster. And so Noah Webster has these blue-backed spellers, which turned out to be one of the most best-selling books of all time. But then there was the debate with Horace Mann, and I think ever since then, somehow phonics has become a political issue. And I think it's also, you know, it is embedded in this back to basics versus child-centered type of approach, which tends to go with political orientation. But I think, you know, reading is a scientific problem. It's not a political problem, and it's not a philosophical problem. It just really is about how the brain learns to connect visual symbols to language. So I think we'd be better off if the politicians got out of it. In most things, actually. Yes? Well, I think, first of all, I think whole language really fell out of the idea that reading is a natural process, like learning how to understand spoken language. And of course, it's not a natural process. So if you put a baby in a spoken language environment, it will learn to speak. If you put a baby in a library, it just won't learn to read. But I think, you know, there is this rhetoric about motivation, and motivation is very important, right? Because if you don't have the motivation to read, if you don't enjoy it, you're never going to get the text experience that you need. But what we also know is if you don't have the foundational skills to actually, you know, get to grips with text, you are just not going to read. It is such a hard problem, and you know, I can see it. It's hard for us to imagine that, but I can see it when I teach these adults how to read these artificial scripts. I mean, it's just totally painstaking. I mean, we have to pay them loads, you know, to come into lab every day and learn these 48 words. You know, and you know, unless they got to be really expert at that, they just wouldn't continue with those scripts. So I think, yes, reading motivation is very important. We talk about motivation in our paper, but I think, you know, you're never going to have the motivation if it's just such a challenge that it's terrible to do it. So phonics, you know, doesn't block enjoyment of reading. It enables it. Is what I think. But thank you. You can ask a second question.
Sorry for being so greedy. Right?
No, it's good.
So many interesting questions. I mean, in fact, English is the second language was mentioned here in this conference. And I mean, now we have probably a lot of kids coming from different backgrounds. I was quite stunned 2 weeks ago when I was looking with my daughter And then she said herself, without instruction, so trzy is written in Polish with CZ, but in Polish, in Spanish and English with CH. So just being exposed to some reading systems make her aware of arbitrariness of the phonographic progression. So I think in many of the debates, kind of additional language seems almost as a burden, as something difficult. I was wondering whether there's any kind of work on how simply seeing this arbitrariness can in fact make it easier to realize how it works.
That's an interesting question, and I don't have the answer to that. I mean, there's a huge literature on bilingualism, and whether it's costly or advantageous, I think, the jury seems to be out. It depends on who you are and what lab you come from. But I think there is some really interesting research about how people who know more than one language, who can read in more than one language, what they're doing when they're actually looking at the text. And what we know is that there's a lot of work from Belgium, because they speak French and Dutch, right? So if you are looking at non-words, even unconsciously, we know that people translate them in both of their languages. Even if they're working, the whole experiment's in Dutch, the instructions were in Dutch, they're a Dutch speaker, but we know that they also unconsciously translate those phonemes somehow to French, which kind of creates a conflict. So we don't really know, maybe that helps your learning. Maybe it makes it more difficult at some stage. I think the jury is out, but they're really fascinating questions. And, it used to be thought that bilingualism research was a little bit niche, but of course most people in the world are bilingual. So really, it should be that monolingual research is the niche bit. And more when we do our studies, we like to use monolinguals because it creates less, sort of untidiness for us. But it's almost impossible to find monolinguals anymore. So I am one. We're a dying breed. Any more? Oh, yep.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. And I want to know, is it okay for us to get access to all the references you cited in your presentation, then we can download it from the site ourselves?
Oh, well, I'm happy to give my slides. Would that help you if I provided my slides?
Just why the Pinyin shows the reference in details. For example, you can present it in detail in your Twitter, and we can connect.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm happy to write a little bibliography if that would help you.
I'm very interested in it, so I can want more understanding about it.
Yeah, if you want to email me as well, I'll do that for you, and I can also give my slides with a bibliography if that would help your studies.
I just checked on the lab email, and can you show us your personal email?
Just look me up on Google. It's really easy to find me, or on Twitter. Thank you.
So just to remind everybody, there's a reception afterwards in the psychology department, which is at number 7 George Square, which is in that direction. And I'd just like to thank Kathy once again for a fantastic talk. Thank you.